At CRLT, we recognize the urgent need to widen our lens from inclusion to a more equity-focused view of teaching and learning. As we began this journey, we asked members of the Michigan teaching community what teaching for equity means to them.
Teaching for equity, to me, is a tool for achieving justice. I want my class to be a just environment, a place where all the students who come to it have a legitimate chance to accomplish the goals of the course. And examining equity and working for equity is necessary to make that be true. So focusing on equity in my course is a way of achieving a bigger goal. So it's not that equity simply is the goal, it's justice really that's the goal.
It makes apparent to students, it kind of demystifies elements of a course that otherwise may be unknown for first generation students, for historically underrepresented students, for minoritized students.
The thing is that we know, especially in sociology, from a lot of the research we do, that a lot of people's participation or apparent demonstration of intelligence is wrapped up in the kind of socialization they've gone through. So who's been taught to think that their experiences and perspectives are valid and valuable, and who has been trained to feel confident, and who just feels entitled to airtime. And a lot of these things are bound up with things like income inequality and other forms of inequality.
And so when I think about equity-minded teaching, I think about facilitating, or as a faculty member, being able to remedy some of those disparities in their experiences and also in their outcomes.
So we have to be able to meet our students where they are. We need to understand what their needs are and adapt our instruction to that.
Encouraging students to be in conversation with me about things that are happening outside of the classroom that are impacting their ability to show up in different ways.
Teaching for equity is the way that we show that we value everyone's basic humanity, that we see everyone as a person with dignity and everyone having something valuable to bring to the table.
The more I incorporate these principles and these ideas into my teaching, the more I am in line with my own values as a person.
Now that we've explored what it means to teach for equity, let's explore why instructors are widening their lens to equity-focused teaching at UM. Dr. Tim McKay explains that he teaches for equity because
the world outside where we work is not perfectly just. It doesn't bring people to us as equals. And so treating them as if everything is exactly, as if treating people perfectly equally will accomplish justice is not really true. So by thinking about equity, I'm working for justice.
There were several motivations to teach for equity that were shared by members of our teaching community. Some, like Dr. Neil Gong, see a gap between disciplinary goals and teaching practices.
And I think the patterns of inequity so I'm in sociology, are in some ways fairly similar to those we see across disciplines in terms of, who participates, whose voice is often heard. I mean, this falls along the kinds of lines of stratification we often see, race, gender, class. I mean, in sociology is a discipline that pays a lot of attention to this, but it doesn't always necessarily, try to rectify this in practice.
Others, like Dr. Paul Fleming, are motivated by the expectations of our students.
I know in my discipline, this is what students are expecting. They're expecting to be trained with an equity lens. They're attuned to issues of equity and racism, and they expect their faculty to be as well, and that their courses are aligned with that. So I've found that the more I'm able to incorporate equitable principles, anti-racist principles, the more students respond and respond well.
As we examine the reasons these instructors are making a choice to address patterns of inequity by teaching for equity, we must consider what instructors could risk and what they have to gain from examining and widening their lens to include equity-focused teaching practices. Dr. Stephanie Hicks suggests that teaching for equity is an iterative process that can improve our teaching and advance our disciplines.
the learning is iterative. So I think you're constantly expanding your toolbox. And I think you become a better instructor because of that. If you know that this is a process that isn't going to end, that is constantly going to develop, it makes you a better practitioner in your field. And I think it also makes your field more attractive to students. I think it makes your teaching more dynamic.
And Dr. Jennifer Jones suggests that what instructors have to risk and gain is shaped by their relationship to the institution and their own identities and experiences.
It is a practice that is fraught with risk, and with vulnerability that can have material impacts on the faculty member, depending upon their positionality within the university, depending upon their intersectional identities. And so while there are real costs and real risks, I believe that the ability for teaching for equity and the kind of vulnerability that I think is so central to teaching for equity, that can really, that the risks are worth it, and that it can really facilitate deeper, more substantive, more generative engagement with course materials and themes.
The generative engagement with course materials and themes that Dr. Jones describes is the result of explicit actions and practices aimed at equitable access and outcomes. Dr. Abner names some concrete practices to consider.
That we know when we have equity-minded teaching, when we do things like diversify our content, diversify our teaching methodologies, diversify our methods of assessment, like we know our students have better experiences in terms of their qualitative evaluation of their experience in the classroom, but we also know that they learn more and learn deeper. So there's a principled reason to do it, but also an evidence-based reason to do it if like student learning is our goal.
As you consider what it means for you to teach for equity in your discipline, we invite you to ask yourself, what do I gain from an equity-focused framework? What do I risk if I do not center equity in my teaching? Dr. Stephanie Hicks reminds us that if we do not actively widen our lens to equity-focused teaching,
and we miss opportunities to think about the worlds that students are actually coming from, and the worlds that we're sending them to, and how we'd like those to actually be more just and more equitable and more livable. And the ways that the spaces that our students are coming from already have value, and we could build on that as opposed to thinking about or focusing on deficit.
What are you ready to do to make your teaching more just? And how will you widen your lens to teach for equity? Visit CRLT's webpage for more information about equity-focused teaching at Michigan, or to request consultation regarding equity-focused teaching in your classroom.